questions about that? So we're going to turn now to talk about specifically about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. To some degree, some aspects of this research tradition grew out of attribution theory, but it does have a longer history in social psychology. It has, in its early days in social psychology, been one of the primary research areas in the field for a number of reasons, and it continues to be one of the hottest areas of research in social psychology, and an area where social psychologists have really, I think, a lot of opportunity to contribute to public welfare and to good public policy. And so I'm going to start by just giving some basic definitions, and then I'm going to sort of start with the punchline, in a sense. Not the full punchline, but I'm going to start with what is probably right now the most prominent model in social psychology for understanding stereotypes. So the current thinking in the field. And then we'll talk about sort of, more historically about different models of thinking about prejudice and stereotypes. And then at the very end of our discussion, we'll talk about what can be done to reduce stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Let's start first with some basic definitions, because we're going to be speaking about theoretical perspectives that consider prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination separately. You'll see some theories focus on prejudice as the most important component that you need to intervene on. Some theories focus on stereotypes as the most important component that you need to focus on for intervention. So it's important to understand how they can be separated. We'll want to distinguish prejudice as involving attitudes. So prejudice would involve negative or hostile attitudes towards a group other than your own. Discrimination is unfair or negative behavior against a group other than your own. So prejudice has to do with the attitudes or feelings, whereas discrimination has to do with the behavior. And remember, we always, in psychology, are talking about thoughts, feelings, and behavior, so we're missing the thoughts. We have the feelings and the behavior. The thoughts are what we would call stereotypes. Stereotypes are beliefs about groups, so they're the thoughts. Unlike prejudice and discrimination, stereotypes, as we'll see, one has about one's own groups as well as groups that one's not a member of. In general, prejudice and discrimination mostly are about other groups, whereas stereotypes, the beliefs, can be about our own groups as well.
Is the prejudice always hostile?
It doesn't have to be hostile. I mean, but in the case that we'll talk about, they'll be mostly hostile, but they don't necessarily have to be. So really, in minimum, prejudice are your attitudes about other groups. And to the extent that they're biased as a function of, you have particular feelings about groups that are not sort of accurate, then you have prejudice, and then the beliefs that go with them would be stereotypes. And so, different theoretical perspectives in social psychology have put relatively more weight on either stereotype or prejudice as being the most important thing to fight against, and the most important component. Even though in general, like in other cases, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors tend to work together. Generally, people's attitudes, behavior, and beliefs tend to be sort of similar to each other. But then the question is, what's the most important underlying mechanism? The sort of most popular perspective today is work done by Claude Steele, who we mentioned briefly in our discussion of cognitive dissonance. He's put forward a theory that is called stereotype threat. And this is really the most prominent perspective right now in the social psychological study of stereotypes and prejudice. Let me tell you about sort of the basic idea of stereotype threat, and then sort of draw out the model, and then we'll talk about the empirical evidence for it. In general, and if it's not clear from the definitions, it'll become more clear as we go through the evidence. Stereotype threat is a general category of phenomena in which people's behavior or performance is affected by their understanding that there is a stereotype about them in that context. The stereotype threat is when there being a stereotype about you influences your behavior or performance. Stereotype threat is a more specific category of the more general social psychological phenomenon known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. And self-fulfilling prophecy is any case in which people's behavior is affected by the expectations that others have for their behavior. And the classic sort of self-fulfilling prophecy effect is kinds of studies like when kids are randomly assigned at the beginning of the school year, and this was actually done many years ago, and the teacher is told randomly that half of them are going to really thrive that year, and the other half are not going to really have a great year. It's totally random, it's not based on any reality. Grades at the end of the year were higher for those the teacher expected to thrive than for those the teacher expected not to thrive. Even though they were randomly assigned, there was no actual difference. That's an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy because the expectation that the teacher had in terms of who was going to succeed and who would not affected their behavior. The expectation of others affected the actual behavior. The stereotype threat is a specific example of a self-fulfilling prophecy in which people's behavior is affected by their awareness that that there is a stereotype about them. So that's the expectation that may be fulfilled in the stereotype threat. And basically what ends up happening is that people end up performing in line with the stereotype because they're aware that the stereotype is there about them. So Claude Steele was really interested in developing stereotype threat theory. He was interested in understanding how people's behavior would be influenced by being a member of a stigmatized group. And what's important in understanding about this theory is that he believed, and you'll see that there's evidence for this, that groups may end up performing differently when there's a stereotype about one of them, not because there are any actual differences in their abilities, but because having a stereotype about you can make you perform less well. So he's really interested in to what degree your performance and behavior could be negatively influenced by your understanding that there's a stereotype about you. And so you really want to understand how non-ability factors could lead to group differences. How you take two groups that were equal in ability, but one of them ends up doing less well on tests because there's a stereotype that they have less ability. So the outcome supports the stereotype, but the process is because of the stereotype. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy due to the stereotype. Claude Steele was originally got into this because he was interested in academic performance of African Americans. He was interested, he's African American himself, he has a very interesting story. His twin brother, Shelby Steele, is very arch conservative. They have really very prominent political scientists that have really opposing views on these things. There was a New York Times Magazine article about them a few years ago. But Claude Steele, he was trying to understand several aspects about differences between Caucasians and African Americans in terms of performance in IQ tests and performance in university environments.